How well can you discern between the Levitical law of Moses versus the unchangeable law of the gospel, and it's a covenant as well? Becoming more general, we could also say the unchangeable gospel versus the law of Moses principle. A principle so that it can be applied not only historically, but even today. What does our discernment matter between the Levitical law and the everlasting gospel? Discerning between the two. What does that matter for our lives today? And what did it matter to the saints anciently? Or put it another way, what does it matter the level of law that we live in our bodies? What does that matter? D&C 130 answers that question, and I'm sure many of you had that come right into your mind as I asked the question. There is a law irrevocably decreed in heaven before the foundation of this world, upon which all blessings are predicated. And when we obtain any blessing from our Heavenly Father, from God, it is by obedience to that law upon which it is predicated. D&C 88 expands on that a little bit more from D&C 130. Verse 21 says, "And they who are not sanctified," notice I have it in red, "through the law which I have given unto you, even the law of Christ, they must inherit another kingdom, even that of a terrestrial kingdom, or that of a telestial kingdom." And if you recall reading that, there's a celestial law, a terrestrial law, and a telestial law. If you live a telestial law, that's the blessing you get. You live a terrestrial law, that's the blessing you get. That's the glory that your body is resurrected with. That's the wattage of the light bulb, a 30 watt, a 60 watt, a 100 watt celestial. And it goes on into verse 22 and 3, "For he who is not able or won't to abide a law of the celestial kingdom cannot abide a celestial glory. And he who cannot or will not abide the law of a terrestrial kingdom cannot abide a terrestrial glory." And then it goes on and talks about, so he must then abide a telestial glory. And if you can't even abide that much law for that glory, then you get a kingdom of darkness, in outer darkness. So what does it matter which level of law we live? It's the whole fundamental basis of this mortal life and our judgment. So it's very important. Okay, let's go it again. The Levitical law of Moses was added because of hard-heartedness and transgression. And it was added to the unchangeable everlasting gospel covenant. Now we'll explore that so you can see a picture in your mind of how that comes out. But here is, when the Israelites came out of Egypt about 1400 BC, they had the gospel preached to them according to Paul in his letter to the Hebrews, which says, "For unto us was the gospel preached, as well as unto them in Moses' day. But the word," the celestial law, the word, "preached did not profit them." Why not? "Not being mixed with faith in them that heard it." And that's a reference to Hebrews 4:2. It is said again, and this is all quoting the prophet Joseph Smith in the Teachings, page 60. It is said again in Galatians 3:9 from Paul that the law of Moses, or the Levitical law, was added because of transgression, the prophet says. What, we may ask, was the law added to? If it was not added to the gospel, it must be plain that it was added to the gospel, the prophet says. So we have the gospel first presented. They rejected it because they didn't have enough faith or not enough willingness to live it. And so the law of Moses is appended as an appendage to it because they had not faith. And so here you see a graphic presentation of that. the law of the gospel being in red, coordinated with the gospel in red in the words. And the law of Moses is kind of overlaps a little bit with the law of the gospel, but it adds stuff to it, which we'll go over, ordinances and performances and so forth to it. So here's Brother McConkie's rendering of it, Mormon doctrine. The particular thing spoken of in the scriptures as the law of Moses, says Brother McConkie, were the ordinances and performances, all the little details that were added because of transgression, verifying what the prophet Joseph said. And so my question then is, if you live the fullness of the gospel, what kind of a blessing do you get? And if you only live the law of Moses portion of the gospel, what kind of a blessing can you expect to receive? And it goes right back to D&C 88, which we just covered. So let's go to the next one. Here is a simple little illustration. I call it the fullness versus the halfness of the gospel. And I've got a pie here. I've got two pies here, actually. Here's a pie. And it's blackberry. It's blackberry. And this is a whole pie. And here I've got the pie also, but I've cut it. And so I'm going to take a little bit of it out. And I'm not very hungry today for pie or for the gospel, so I only want part of it. And so we take out a little bit more of the pie. And now we have what we might call the halfness of the gospel. Okay, versus the fullness of the gospel. So simple, basically either or logic. We'll give some other options on that later. So there we go, full. The fullness, the state of being full, whole, complete, entire. And what does that represent? The higher or celestial law. So this is just an object lesson to demonstrate that, so visually you can see it and it makes sense to you. Now let's do the other half, the other side. So here is the halfness of the gospel, partial, less than full or complete, and it might be in degrees, but this is kind of an either or, so you can see it. And what does that represent? The lower or lesser law. So this is important because that's the object of our whole presentation. Can you tell the difference between the fullness of the gospel and the halfness of the gospel? And we're going to show that that is not as easy as it appears with the pies here. Okay, gospel law versus Levitical lower law. And I put that in green, gospel law in red. And in my mind, I carry a 4-color pen, and red is my highest as I mark my scriptures. And the top of the rainbow is red. And the ultraviolet or the black is at the bottom of my 4-color pen. So, and Levitical is a step down from the red or the gospel. So this presentation obviously is just a very short presentation of a very big subject. This will introduce you. So let's say the gospel law, the ancient and unchangeable gospel, is a theme of Brigham Young and the successors of the prophet Joseph Smith. I went through the Journal of Discourses, 26 volumes, and pulled out this gospel, ancient and unchangeable, in Brigham Young and John Taylor, Wilford Woodruff, Lorenzo Snow, and so forth. This is the hardbound version of it, but there's 100 subjects in here, and one of the ones that were impressive to me, and Wilford Woodruff is one of the strongest ones teaching on this in here. These are almost verbatim. They're very close, but I give you the reference so you can go look it up online, or if you've got a set of the conference reports back between 1852 and 1886. So this is the hardbound version. For those who are getting a little older and their eyes aren't quite as well, this is a paperback version. It's exactly the same. It's just a larger print. So be aware of that. So in this subject, in this volume, the LDS Conference Report extracts, we've got 7 pages of quotes. So that would be like 1 page, 2 pages. And so it is a theme that they are spending time on. However, look, 7 pages versus 18 pages in the on the law of Moses principle. So almost 3 times as much the brethren felt impressed by the Spirit to talk about the law of Moses principle, so that the saints then could understand it, and so we could understand it today. And so 3 times the exposure. So the gospel law, the ancient unchangeable gospel, versus the Levitical lower law, or the law of Moses principle, I call it, because they are applying that to us today in the dispensation of the fullness of times. Okay? So be aware that that's available. So let's set our definition just very briefly here. What is the unchangeable gospel? What does that mean? Well, here's Brother McConkie again. He gives us a definition. He summarizes a lot of stuff. He does a very good job. And he says the gospel of Jesus Christ is, or is equal to, the plan of salvation. It embraces all the laws, principles, doctrines, rights, ordinances, acts, powers, authorities, keys, necessary, what? To save and to exalt men in the highest heaven hereafter. So all the laws, if they're lived and lived within the conditions thereof, then the person gets all the reward, which is the celestial kingdom exaltation. It, the gospel of Jesus Christ, is the covenant. Talked about in D&C 1. You can look that, review that. It's the covenant of salvation which the Lord makes with men on earth. That's Mormon Doctrine, page 331 in my 1966 version. He goes on and says, the gospel is the everlasting covenant because it is ordained by him who is everlasting. It's the only thing he can give. And also because it is everlastingly the same. Now, I've underlined the same for a reason, because it's so easy to change things, little things that mount up to big things, drip by drip by drip. In all ages past, salvation was gained by adherence to its, the gospel's, terms and conditions. If you meet all the terms and conditions, you get all the reward. It's very simple. And that same compliance will bring the same reward in all future ages. Because God doesn't change, his gospel doesn't change, the principles, ordinance, and doctrines don't change. And so we know exactly where we're at, no matter what part of the scriptures we read. Former day saints or latter day saints in our very day. We can measure it. It's not that difficult. Okay, each time the everlasting covenant, the gospel, is revealed, it is new to those in that new dispensation. So it's the new. Thus the title of the gospel, the new and everlasting covenant. It's newly revealed, but it is still an everlasting covenant that is always the same from Adam to infinitum. It's the same on every world system. It is the fullness of the gospel, unless we scale it down on the dimmer switch to a lower or lesser law, which brings a lesser reward. Okay, what are some synonyms, very quickly here, of the carnal law of Moses? It's also referred to. And because I, Jesus, said unto you that old things have passed away, this is the resurrected Lord to the Nephites, and this is 3 Nephi 15, right after he cited all of the celestial laws and character that have to be incorporated into a person to make it into his family and into the celestial kingdom. He now is explaining in 12, 13, and 14 is the Sermon on the Mount, or the Sermon by the Temple. And now 15 goes into the law of Moses compared to the gospel, exactly what this presentation is presenting. And so Jesus says, because I said unto you that old things have passed away, and I've underlined that in green. Old things have passed away. They die. I do not destroy that which hath been spoken concerning the things which are to come. So futuristic prophecy, full of the Spirit of God, the full law. For behold, the covenant, and I've got it in red, which I have made with my people is not all fulfilled or accomplished or been acted out as it was decreed in heaven. But the law, in green, which was given to Moses, hath an end. So green leaves in the winter turn dead. They have an end. But an evergreen, supposedly the leaves stay on it. Old things pass away, that's the law of Moses. So you can see how he's coded that. And then in verse 9 he says, behold, I am the law. And I am, of course, in Hebrew would be Jehovah. Jehovah is the law. I am the law. And the light, look unto me and endure to the end, and ye shall live celestially. For unto him that endureth to the end will I give eternal light, celestially. That's 3 Nephi 15. Now let's just summarize old things. I've got it in green. Things that come to an end. Old covenant. Schoolmaster for a child, not an adult. Law of carnal commandments. Things that can change. And so if baptism changed from immersion to sprinkling, that's a change. We know that's not the gospel. It's maybe some part or a lower symbolic level that leads our mind to baptism, but it's not baptism. So now the question. Now we've taken these principles, and now we're going to, old teachers die hard and never go away. So we're going to do a little quiz. So how well can you discern between the law of carnal commandments and the gospel? And we're going to go through these fast. We're not going to take time to explain them. I want you to see that this is a very important endeavor. And that's why Jesus hit it right after the Sermon on the Mount. So here's carnal versus the gospel. So Brigham Young challenges us here. The prophet said this one day, and he questioned our ability to discern between the two. Not only the Protestants and the Catholics, but he even challenges us to discern the difference. So we'll see how much of the Spirit of the Lord is in you and where your IQ is on discerning this. And he says, it will be hard for any divine, Protestant or LDS theologians, I'm applying it, that now lives to draw the line between the law of carnal commandments, the law of Moses, and the law of divine commandments, the unchangeable, everlasting gospel. Very difficult, he says. Let's see if he's right. He says at his final, I have not seen them that can do it, except maybe a few of the brethren that he was talking to. And so I then ask, and I put it in a raised font there, how about us? Can we do it? Well, let's see. So are the following part of the law of Moses, I put it in green, think green aprons, are the law of the gospel, and I've got that in red. So on the left hand, the right hand. 20 quick questions. Okay, so you're going to go law of the gospel, red, law of Moses, green. So you're going to be doing this in your mind. So here's a quote, make sacred priesthood garments for your name, including a robe, a sash, a turban, or a cap, Exodus 28. Is that gospel or law of Moses? 2, the 10 Commandments. The 10 Commandments here, and this is like stone or synthesized stone, so 5 and 5. The 10 Commandments, are they part of the gospel or the law of Moses? because the law of Moses dies and goes away. Are the Ten Commandments still in vogue? And they're always in vogue, no matter what dispensation, Mosaic or full gospel dispensations. And there's the scriptures afterwards. Third, if a person steals, they must pay back double up to 5 times. Is that gospel or law of Moses? Anyone who has sexual relations with an animal must die. Gospel or law of Moses? And there's the references after. You can look those up and stop the video. Number 5, charge no interest or usury to your brothers, in the gospel especially. Exodus 22, is that law of the gospel or the law of Moses? And what are you doing in your business as you deal with the Latter-day Saints? Woo. Now 6, quiz continued. Celebrate the 3 annual festivals or the holy days in Exodus 23 and so forth. Gospel or law of Moses, done away with in Christ. Blood offerings or sacrificing animals. Is that gospel or the law of Moses? And we're going to come back to this one. This one is going to impact you. 8, do not eat lobster, pork, pepperoni on your pizza. Leviticus 11, is that gospel or law of Moses and was done away? We don't have to do it anymore. 9, write a bill of divorcement or a release for any uncleanness or if a wife does not please her husband or vice versa. Divorce, is that the law of the Lord, celestial law of gospel on divorce, or is that law of Moses and we don't have to worry about that? And 10, a man who has intercourse or sleeps in the same bed with his menstruating wife is unclean for 7 days. Is that gospel or is that law of Moses? And there's the scriptures. 11, do not eat blood. Maybe could be applied to transfusions. Leviticus, gospel, law of Moses. Rebuke your neighbor frankly so as not to share in his guilt when you see somebody doing something wrong. In the gospel, do I have to do that? Or is that part of the law of Moses and I'm not really responsible for it? On the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Shall is the English imperative. Is that gospel or law of Moses? And if you say gospel, then we're going to have to deal with Moroni on talking about that, aren't we? And Joseph Smith, who talks about it in Genesis 17, the Joseph Smith translation. 14, not practice divination, sorcery, horoscope reading, or tarot cards, or the astrology charts, etc., etc. Is that gospel or is that law of Moses? Can we do that? Or is it a gospel principle? 15, do not cut your bodies or put tattoo marks on yourself. Gospel or law of Moses? Okay, we're into the last ones. Are you finding any of these questions difficult? Just 5 more. Bear with me. 16, do not commit adultery. Both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death. Is that the celestial law? Or is that a law of Moses? And so we can get divorces. 17, if a man lies with a man, it's called detestable, he must be put to death. Is that the law of the gospel or the law of Moses and we're not responsible? This is a hot one in the world today, especially in America and Western Europe. And 18, we're getting close to the end. You're doing well. The land is to have a Sabbath of rest every 7 years. Gospel or the law of Moses? When you do a garden, do you rest the land every 7 years? Are you required to by the celestial law here on earth? 19, a woman shall not wear men's clothing. And men shall not wear women's clothing, or they are an abomination. Gospel or law of Moses? Now we've hit fashions. This is going to step on some toes. And the last one is more complete and kind of a summary question that Jesus gave in the Sermon on the Mount. Do not think that I am come to abolish the law. Now notice I put it the in red and the law in green, because there's two laws. Which is he saying? I've not come to abolish the law, the red law, or the green law. See, green laws grow old and die. The red law doesn't. So that's why I put it there, to cause your mind to focus. Do not think that I've come to abolish the celestial law. Did he come to abolish the Mosaic law? Yes. So you know which one he's talking about. Or the prophets. I put it in red also. But to fulfill. Now, I looked up fulfill because this is kind of a weasel word. The translator's choices are a great array of differences here. So went to my Webster's 1828 to see how it was back in the days of the prophet Joseph Smith. And to fulfill means to put into effect. It also can mean to end. Put into effect or end. It means to measure up. It means to satisfy. It means to convert into reality. Did Jesus do that with the celestial law? It means to exemplify. So that all of a sudden, do away with, fulfill, it's kind of like two sides of a door. And if you translate that wrong, you may be going out instead of coming in to the celestial kingdom. And then he adds on to this, anyone who breaks one of the least of these commandments, that's going to be red, and teaches others to do the same, will be called least in the kingdom of God. Because they might make the bottom of the celestial kingdom, but they're definitely at the bottom, the least, or maybe the terrestrial kingdom. We've got to be careful that we understand and can discern the difference between the celestial law and the carnal law of Moses. Not only in the scriptures, but for us today, as I've demonstrated with these 20 questions. Let's go on. Why is there a law of Moses? We need to get a little bit of historical perspective. I'll just go very quickly. I don't want to be tedious for you. To Moses, the Lord first gave the higher priesthood and revealed the fullness of the gospel. So when Moses came down the first time, he had the commandments, but it was the celestial law. And they were written on both sides. But Israel rebelled, and they manifest such gross unworthiness that their God took from them the power in the priesthood. I guess so they had to go to doctors. I don't know. Whereby they could have become a kingdom of priests and kings. They could have. But gross unworthiness. They did not have power in their priesthood. And he gave them instead a lesser law, a law of carnal commandments. Green, a preparatory gospel. And that should bring up into your mind D&C 84. A schoolmaster for children. To bring them to Christ and the fullness of the gospel. He gave them instead the law of Moses. I don't know if you can feel some sadness here. The realization, they thought they had it all. Moses received by revelation many great gospel truths. As for instance, the Ten Commandments are gospel truths, recorded in the 20th chapter of Exodus and the 5th chapter of Deuteronomy. These gospel truths in red, being eternal in their nature, are part of the fullness of the everlasting gospel. So here he's saying the Ten Commandments are part of the law of Moses, And they're part of the everlasting gospel. That's why the green overlapped with the red a little bit there. There is an overlap. They have always been enforced, says Brother McConkie, in all dispensations. They are part of the law of Christ. So the Ten Commandments have not been done away with. So that's Mormon doctrine 434. Now, brief scriptural history of the law of Moses. Most of you are aware of this, but we'll just breeze through it. Jehovah said to Moses, teach them ordinances and laws. Is that red or green? Let's see if I'm right, if it's red. And thou shalt show them the way, in red, wherein they must walk, and the work they must do. So this is Joseph Smith translation. If they will obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant, red, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, above all other people on the earth. Those who keep the commandments, the celestial law, are special because they're keeping his law on earth as it is in heaven. For all the earth is mine, he says. And then he adds, all the people answer together. This is the children of Israel back about 1400 and something BC. All the people answered Moses together and said, all that Jehovah hath spoken, we will do. We covenant with Jehovah to do this. And within a couple of weeks, you know what happened. And here the prophet adds, the tables were written on both sides. The full celestial law was written on both sides. When it came down the next time, they were not written on both sides. So that's Exodus 32:15. And here we go into 32:19. Moses came down from the mountain with the full law, and he gets down. The Lord had already warned him, so he had time to process it. He comes down, and they're doing the naked dance around the golden calf. And there's thousands of people doing this. It's just a party. That's the way they must have been calling it. A lot of people were standing back and watching, and others were way far back, and they didn't want to watch it. And so all the children of Israel, 3 million of them approximately, according to Orson Pratt. So Moses saw the people, the calf and the dancing, and Moses' anger waxed hot. He was livid. He was so angry because he had just been in the presence of God. The contrast. And he cast the tablets and he broke them because of so great a sin. People were naked, and the order was given for the Levites to slay every man that had participated in this, and I suppose the women that were with him, but especially the men. And there were 3,000 people that were slaughtered by the swords of the Levites right there. 3,000 people. You could say half of a stake in an organized stake. Half of the people were killed by the Levites. Jehovah then plagued the rest of the people who watched and didn't stop it because they didn't stop it. They just were aloof. And then he says in Exodus 33, I will not, consequence now, I will not go up in the midst of thee, for thou art a stiff-necked people in green, lest I consume thee in the way. But Jehovah spake unto Moses face to face, as a man speaketh unto his friend, in red. Thou canst not see my face, Moses, any longer, because the sins of the people, the whole church, now came upon Moses. And so he had to carry that weight, so he could no longer see the face of God himself, and he had not sinned. But the weight was on him. But my back parts, my face shall not be seen. So he could see the back of God, but he couldn't see his face and talk to him as a friend. So God is basically turning his back even on Moses, because he's the head of this assembly of this church, the ancient Latter-day Saints. So that's a brief scriptural history of the law of Moses. So let's look at it in the King James versus the Joseph Smith translation to see it more specifically. Just very quickly here. Jehovah said unto Moses, hew thee, he has to cut him out himself this time. The first time God did it. This time Moses had to chip him out. Hew thee 2 other tablets of stone like the first, and I will write upon them also the words of the law. And I put it in green, the law, and it's not capitalized. The words of or from the law, according as they were written on the first tablets which thou breakest. And so then now the prophet has seen all this in vision when he read the Bible with the Urim and Thummim. He saw the whole thing like a movie in detail. How hard is it to correct a text or to add to it and add to more this time and this time? He saw it all in a movie. You could do it if you saw the same movie. And here's what I put in red, the celestial part that's kind of been filtered out. The meaning has been lost, if not the words. But it shall not be according to the first set that he came down with. For I will take away the priesthood, the Melchizedek priesthood. They're left with an Aaronic priesthood, a Levitical law, with all the keep them busy ordinances. I will take the priesthood out of their midst, therefore my holy order and the ordinances thereof shall not go before them. For my presence shall not go up in their midst, lest I destroy them, because they are so resistant to his spirit. But I will give unto them the law as at first, but it shall be after the law of carnal commandments. For I have sworn in my wrath. And wrath is not a pleasant word there. That's the Joseph Smith translation. Now, King James, we can compare those two right across there, and you can stop this video and look at that and make those comparisons yourself. And so in the King James, I'll just read it, and I've done the cross out, the words. Jehovah said unto Moses, hew thee 2 other tables of stone like unto the first, and I will write upon them also these tables and the words of the law according as they were written that were in the first on the tablets which thou breakest. So you can see as you compare the JST with the King James, a lot has been lost in the translation somehow. So the prophet now gives us the why, the law of Moses, and we already know that, don't we? He says, we cannot keep all the commandments without first knowing them. So if we were living with the former day saints and we had the 10 commandments in the tabernacle, and it's the law of God. And so the people all grow up believing they've got it all, but they've really got only a half a pie. So they think they're former day saints, but they're more former day ain'ts. They're looking for the S, aren't they? So you can't keep the commandments unless you know them. And we cannot expect to know all or more than we now know unless we comply with and keep with those which we already have received. And the prophet goes on again and says, blessings offered, the first set of tablets, but rejected are no longer blessings. What are they then? They're curses. So the half of the pie here I can be blessed for, but the other half, what fills that in? Hot air or whipped cream, or it's curses, because we've lost all of this if we were living in the days of the children of Israel. So no longer blessings but curses, but become like the talent hid in the earth by the wicked and the slothful servant, to be taken away that which he hath or might have had, said the prophet Joseph. TPJS 256. Now he goes on and tries to explain the mechanics of this, and we've gone over it several times, but it now may fit, the pieces may fit a little better. Quote, if there is no change of ordinances, there is no change of priesthood. So if we see ordinances being changed in the Old Testament or in the New Testament or today, what do we know about the priesthood? If we're turning down the ordinances, making them simpler, easier, what do we know about the priesthood? And especially power in the priesthood. We're turning down the power circuit. The light is dimming. So there's the prophet Joseph, and he quotes Paul another way. He says, where there is no change of priesthood, there's no change of the ordinance. So he said it both ways, the way Paul did. And so here we've got, he's looking into heaven and he sees why this is so. God set the ordinances, for instance, baptism, to be the same forever and ever, in Adam's day and today. If you change baptism and you're going to do it by sprinkling or pouring, it's a change. And set who to watch over it? He set Adam to watch over them, the prophet said. Adam watches over the ordinances to make sure they don't change for all of his children to the end of time of this earth. And the ordinances must be kept in the very way God has appointed. How do we know that? What did the prophet reveal? That's our best source. Otherwise, their priesthood will prove a cursing instead of a blessing. Their priesthood will be half a priesthood instead of a full Melchizedek covenant priesthood. Very, very sobering thoughts as we look at our former day brothers and sisters and we begin to understand why the Lord picks this up in D&C 84, which we're coming to. Okay, here's the modern commentary on ancient Israel. So the Lord in our day, this is D&C 84 that I just referred to. They hardened their hearts, them back then, them there then. The Lord in his wrath took Moses out of their midst and the holy priesthood, the full order of priesthood. And he gave them a lesser priesthood, which continued for the next 1,400 years. And they grew up with it, knowing that they had it all. But they didn't. They had half a pie. And what did they get? They got a preparatory gospel in green, a gospel of repentance and the law of carnal commandments. And he gave it in his wrath, says D&C 84, until John was raised up from his mother's womb. And you all know this quote. And here's Joseph Smith again. Ordinances instituted in heaven are not to be altered or changed. All must be saved from Adam to ad infinitum by the same exact ordinances, the same principles, covenants, and so forth. This is the prophet Joseph Smith. This is not me. Now here we've got the 7 dispensations. We can see it now in an 8,000-year overview, and I've gone through it into the 2nd millennium. And so you see Adam here in red, the everlasting gospel covenant, and it continues to Enoch, and you got Seth and the ones in between there, but I'm not hitting them all. Then you've got Noah, then you get Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Ephraim. And then you've got Moses comes down, he's half red and half green. He comes down and he's got the celestial law, which he lived his whole life. And at least 70 of the elders that went up with him and ate dinner with God, they did. We don't have a record of what happened to them. Did they become the Sanhedrin? We don't know. Anyway, so Moses is red and green because he's living one law and administering a lower law to the rest of the church. And then we see after Moses, something, I've got a red line underneath, we don't know. Did those 70 elders and Moses' descendants keep it alive like with Jethro, who had a temple, we believe, out in the Midian wilderness? And so then we get to John the Baptist at 30-something years after that. And notice that it starts to be red. And then Jesus comes and restores the full Melchizedek laws, ordinances, powers, systems, everything. And within 100 years, that tapers off, until we lose any record of what may have happened for a little bit. And then with Joseph Smith, we see a restoration of the celestial law first, and that's supposed to continue all the way into the first millennium, the seventh day, and on into the eighth day. So the seventh day is where we go from telestial to terrestrial, and the eighth day we go from terrestrial to celestial. Okay, so there's the 7 major dispensations. Now, let's come back to number 7 of our quiz before. I promised you I would come back to it. Blood offerings, are they gospel or law of Moses? So let's look at that. I want you actually in your mind, the law of the gospel or the law first given to Moses. I'm adding that on now, so you should be able to hold that. And down with the law of Moses. Is the blood sacrifice of animals part of the law of Moses or the gospel of Jesus Christ? And most of you are probably saying, of course, it's the law of Moses because it was done away with. Well, let's look further. The prophet does talk about this. Here's his key to understanding blood sacrifices. Hold on to your hats. Quote from the prophet Joseph Smith himself. He shall purify the sons of Levi, Levitical, Levi, that they may offer unto the Lord. It will be necessary here to make a few observations on the doctrine set forth in the above quotation. A few observations. And it is generally supposed, I've got it in green, that sacrifice was entirely done away when the great sacrifice in red, the sacrifice of the Lord Jesus Christ, was offered up, and that there will be no necessity, green, for the ordinance of animal sacrifice in the future. And what is the word he used? Generally supposed. But those who assert this, those who suppose, are certainly not acquainted with the duties, privileges, and the authority of the priesthood, Melchizedek priesthood, or with the prophets. He goes on and says, the offering of sacrifice has ever been connected and forms part of the duties of the priesthood. It began with the priesthood and will be continued until after the coming of Christ, from generation to generation forever. How do we work that all out? Here he goes. We frequently have mention made of the offering of sacrifice by the servants of the Most High in ancient days, prior to the law of Moses. So that first 2,500 years from Adam to Moses, 2,500 years. That's from our day back to Nephi. So they had the full gospel. And then they had it all the way into Moses' life, which he continued. But he didn't keep administering the fullness. He administered a Levitical law in wrath. So he says, prior to the law of Moses, everything from that 2,500 years was the gospel. So Adam, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, everything Abraham did was gospel. That's what the prophet's teaching here. Which ordinances, which gospel ordinances, will be continued when the priesthood is restored with all its authority, power, and blessings. TPJS 172. Then I asked this rhetorical question. I'll let you kind of wrestle with it. Is there a Melchizedek as well as a Levitical order of animal sacrifices? There's that chart again, 7 major dispensations. Study that over. Make sure you understand what happened the first 2,500 years, because we have so little detail there. That first 2,500 years is covered in Genesis. 2,500 years. We have almost no detail. And so what the prophet adds here from having read the Bible with the Urim and Thummim, fills in some very significant details, even though he only had a few years to live to give us. Okay, law of Moses compared to the everlasting gospel. Just go through this quickly. It's a summary. So the law of Moses was temporary. It was given angrily or wrathfully because of sin. It's old things, things that come to an end, old covenants, Old Testament. So is the whole Old Testament done away with Christ? The law of carnal commandments, things that can and do change, are altered over time. So think through history, and even in our day. Is there anything being changed? Are ordinances being changed? Do we still baptize by immersion? Can you think of any ordinances that have been changed? Now here's the other side. Everlasting gospel covenants, given because of the Lord's love for us. He wants us to be like him, to grow up to be like him. They're new to us, but they're everlastingly from world system to world system. Things that are eternal and never end. Everlasting covenant revealed anew. Fullness of the gospel, the law of the gospel. Principles, laws, and ordinances that never change. Okay, so I alluded to New Testament, Old Testament, so we better look at that more specifically. So we've got New Testament means New Covenant. Testament, one translation. Covenant would be a valid translation. So here, Mormon doctrine, Brother McConkie says, thus we find Paul, as his words have now been preserved in the King James Version of the Bible, writing in one place of Jesus, the mediator of the New Covenant, and in another, the mediator of the New Testament. So Brother McConkie is trying to help us to make the jump. That's just a translator's choice. The meaning is the same in each case. Modern translations of the Bible use the word covenant rather than testament in nearly every instance. So he's not saying the King James is the only one we should be looking at. If you go to BibleHub.com, you can read 20 of them in the same verse in 20 translations. And so fast. So everybody really should be using some like a software like that. So there is the New Testament, or the New Covenant, or the New Covenant revealed anew, or the ancient covenant revealed anew. Now let's look at the Old Testament. The law of carnal commandments, the law of performances and ordinances, keep them busy type gospel, revealed through Moses, was an old covenant that dies like green leaves, as compared with the gospel restored by Jesus and his apostles. Brother McConkie continues, but this New Testament or New Covenant, this restored gospel, was the same testament, the same covenant that had been in force between God and his people from Adam to Moses, 2,500 years, in both the Old and New Testament. So what's he saying? The gospel's in the Old Testament. How much? Well, what did the law of Moses add to the gospel covenant? Here I've got it in a graphic format. You've got the red gospel, and you've got the law of Moses overlapping with it a little bit because the 10 Commandments are in both, and a few other things. So what did the law of Moses add to the gospel? Here's Brother McConkie again, summarizing and bringing it together for us. But the particular things spoken of in the scriptures as the law of Moses were the ordinances and performances, we read that before, that were added because of transgression. They were diverse washings and carnal ordinances imposed on them until the time of Reformation. And the first part of that is with Jesus coming back, and then again with Joseph Smith coming back. They were the law of commandments contained in the ordinances, Brother McConkie says. So their ordinances had been dumbed down more and more and more until they had just a skeleton left of the original. And so if we dumb down the ordinances, we dumb down priesthood power, we dumb down the potential blessings that can be received. The law of Moses was added to the gospel because of the hard-heartedness and the transgressions of the people. And what was it added to? As the diagram shows, it was added to the gospel. And because it overlaps a little bit, they thought they had it all, but they didn't. And what they were living would not take them to the celestial kingdom. So let's go to the next one. Here's a question for us to ponder a little bit more about them there then and me here now, and what can I learn from them? So I asked this question kind of rhetorically. Are some of our blessings of Abraham fulfilled or done away with in Christ? Is that the way we look at it? For instance, the great thing for us to know, said the prophet Joseph Smith, is to comprehend what God did institute before the foundation of the world. So if we can get that in our mind back then. But he asked the question, but who knows what he did before the foundation of the world? Implying that's what we need to understand. We need to have that revealed to us. It is the constitutional disposition, and notice I have this in green, of mankind to set up stakes and set bounds to the works and the ways of the Almighty. This is how far you can get me to go, Father. Don't ask me to go any further than this. I remember hearing a story about Brigham Young. A woman came to Brigham Young, and he was patiently listening, and she went through all the things, how many times she was driven from her home and on and on and on. And she says something to the effect, but President Young, I'll be damned if I'm going to be driven out again. And he looked at her and he said, that's exactly right, my dear. You will be damned unless you do. And so there we are. We set up stakes, and it becomes part of our nature, our constitutional disposition. So here the prophet asks this haunting question to me, perhaps to you. Why be so certain that you comprehend the things of God, when all things with you are so uncertain? You are welcome to all the knowledge and intelligence I can impart to you, however. But as I reveal something to you from God, believe me that I'm telling you it came from God. So what does this phrase more fully mean? Ponder it a little bit. Again, rhetorical. All the laws, rights, and ordinances, together with the blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Ponder on what the full scope of that may mean. So here's the question we began with. How well can you and me discern between the law of Moses versus the unchangeable law of the gospel covenant? Or the unchangeable gospel versus the law of Moses principle, applying it to ourselves? Why does it matter? So graphically, let's just compare it here. Why does it matter whether you live the whole gospel or half the gospel? Why does it matter? Thank you.